Greetings and salutations. Thank you for clicking on the video. It is time yet again for another Q&A where I go through the comments that we've gotten here on the YouTube channel and other places and give you my opinions. And we've gotten a lot of comments since the last Q&A video. I spent quite some time going through all of the comments, especially on YouTube, and I want to say thank you very much for all the nice positive comments that I've gotten. Get way more positive than negative these days, and I think that is awesome. So thank you very much. And also at the end of the video, I want to talk a little bit about the logo contest we have going here at EzeeLinux. So we'll do that at the end for those of you who are interested. The first two questions that I have up here, the two comments, are just examples of comments that I get all the time. The first one is about Zorin. Obviously on that video I had talked about what distribution of Linux I was recommending for my mom, and this person goes through and explains about how Zorin is good for people who switch over from Windows. I do not like Zorin, and there's not a week that goes by that somebody doesn't say, why don't you try Zorin? And I've noticed that a lot of those recommendations come from people who don't use Zorin. They're running something like Ubuntu or Fedora or Arch, and they go, well, Zorin is supposed to be good for that, so you ought to use that. And I have tried Zorin on several occasions, and each time that I have, it just does not work. I have never been able to get it to work well enough to do a review video, and so therefore I cannot recommend this to EzeeLinux clients. I have no desire to support it, and there are several things about the Zorin desktop experience that I don't agree with. It tries to emulate Windows. It has a desktop that tries to be something like what you would get in Windows 7, for instance. They have the Wine layer installed by default so people can put Microsoft programs on there, and I'm getting to a place where I don't want anything at all to do with the Microsoft ecosystem at all. And I actually made the decision when I upgraded my machines to Ubuntu Mate, or however you want to say that, that I was not going to install Wine, and I got rid of what few Windows applications that I had been installing just to have them around, because I really never used them all that much. And I just don't like that concept. I think that Linux is Linux and Windows is Windows and Macintosh is Macintosh, and the constant comparisons or imitations from one system to another really don't do us a whole lot of good. Linux needs to be appreciated as Linux. And we are at a place where there's really not much Microsoft software out there that you can't find an alternative in the open source world that will do the same job and probably do it better. Okay? Not everything is like that. There are some people that really absolutely have to have some Windows around, and I understand that, but for me, I don't need it, and most of the clients that I work with don't need it. So not a big fan of Zorin, and I don't like to speak negatively of an open source project. I just don't agree with their philosophy. And I think that their system doesn't work very well. It's getting to a point with me where I am really skeptical of any distribution of Linux which is based on Ubuntu but is not an official Ubuntu spin. So for instance, now I'm using Ubuntu Mate 1604. That is an official spin of Ubuntu. It has full support from Canonical. Anybody else who is using the Ubuntu base that is not an official spin, like Ubuntu GNOME or Xubuntu or Xubuntu, however you want to say that, or Lubuntu or any of those other spins of Ubuntu, they're just not as stable. They don't work as well. Linux Mint may be an exception to that, and we'll talk more about Mint here in just a few moments. Here's another very typical comment that I get that I wanted to address and talk about. I have tried several attempts at installing one distro or another on my desktop with mixed results. None were more than 80% successful. Some wouldn't install at all. All of the distros that did install had severe stability issues. i.e. display backups. I hold out hope for the future, but so far, no go. And I've withheld this commenter's name from this video simply because I don't want to appear to be singling somebody out. This question or this comment is something that I get all the time. And unfortunately, some people have these sorts of experiences and then they will go out and just tell everybody that Linux sucks because they couldn't get it to work. And there's a lot that goes into this, but mainly what you're dealing with here is this is hardware we're talking about. Not every computer that is designed to run Windows will run Linux well. Not every computer that is designed to run Windows will run Windows well. Okay? Hardware is different. Each computer has its own personality. I realize that it's all supposed to be plug and play and it's all supposed to work together, but sometimes there are conflicts and things that are going on within a machine. Something funky's going on with the hardware that just makes it so it doesn't work very well. And I learned that lesson way back a long time ago when I went to work for Gateway Computer. I worked there in the late 90s, and I'm going to take a minute and tell you this story because it's the main reason that I did not continue working for Gateway. So the plant that I worked in, downstairs was the actual factory where the machines were assembled. Upstairs was where the big call center was for tech support, people to call in. And also upstairs was a computer lab where a lot of design work was done for new machines. And the way they would do this is they would get a crew of guys together who would come up with an idea for a new package that they were going to sell. And so you'd get all the hardware together and you'd build one of these machines by hand. And you would test it, you'd burn it in, you'd make sure it would work, and it would be a good solid design, and they'd say, okay. And then they would put all the specifications together and then send it down to the factory, and then the promotion team would actually sell the machine and that sort of thing. Once these machines were starting to be made, what Gateway did that I didn't like was that when they designed the machine, they would have a certain hard drive, they would have a certain motherboard, they would have a certain CD-ROM drive. This was the late 90s. And this was right when plug and play was just starting to happen. Those of us who remember using computers back further than that, adding a piece of hardware to a computer used to be a bit of a pain. You'd have to go in there and set jumper switches for IRQs and all kinds of crazy stuff you'd have to do. And this was right at the time when plug and play was going to come along. And while things always, they were supposed to work always, they didn't always work. And you would get these weird conflicts. And what they would do is, as the production continued on these machines, if they found a source to get cheaper hard drives, let's say they started out with a Western Digital, if they found that Seagate was selling a similarly spec'd hard drive and they could get it cheaper, they would put that into production. And then all of a sudden a bunch of these machines would go out and you'd start getting issues because now it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And that's one of the reasons that the experience that most people had with Gateway Computer was is that they either would buy one and it worked like a tank, it was a tank and it worked forever and you couldn't break it, or they were just crap out of the box. Okay? And it's because of those little changes. So not every computer is similar. And the reason why I didn't work for the company, the department that I was in, was that we were troubleshooting those problems. And I kept looking around and going, look, if you keep changing this up like this, we have issue on top of issue. It was kind of silly. So anyway, I didn't continue to work there. But I did learn a lot about hardware, and not every machine is created equally. So if you're having this sort of experience when you're trying to use Linux, then you may want to consider getting another machine. Get a machine that will run Linux better. You can buy brand new hardware from companies like System76 and Dell that come loaded with Linux. They are designed to run Ubuntu. And that might be a really good way to go. And the System76 and Dell machines that are designed to run Ubuntu, hey, I mean, if you spend the money on it and it doesn't work, you can always put Windows back on the thing. I mean, but don't be so quick to say Linux sucks because of hardware issues. It's not necessarily Linux's fault that it won't run on your old machine. But I have found, because I've done so many installs over the years, that those sorts of problems where you have a machine that just simply will not do it, they're very few and far between. I've actually been very surprised at how few of the clients that I've worked with have come back to me later and said, oh, I've got a major issue, this doesn't work, that doesn't work. Most of the time, if I can get them a really good install and we know everything's working before I turn them loose, they're fine. They just run. So, anyway. So, I could go on about that, but the main point of that is, yeah, I'm sorry that you're having those experiences, but take a real good look at the hardware you're using. One more thing I wanted to say about that was, we're getting to a place in the Linux ecosystem where it's kind of ridiculous to me to have somebody go out and buy a machine that was designed to run Windows and then expect to get Linux running on it. It's getting to a place where it's like if I went out and bought a Mac and wanted to load Windows 10 on it. That's going to be a big pain in the butt. You might be able to get it to work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work well. Or vice versa, making a Hackintosh, getting a x86 based machine designed for Windows and Linux and then trying to get Mac to run on it. People do it, I understand that, but for me, I want hardware that's going to complement the software that I have. And with all of the companies popping up these days that are building machines specifically for Linux, then that seems to be actually a better way to go than trying to get it to work on a machine that was not designed for your hardware. More on that as we roll along. What is the difference between Ubuntu Mate and Mint Mate, or Mate, however you want to say that? This is a question that I've been getting because I've been posting a lot of videos about Ubuntu Mate, and in the past I have posted a lot about Linux Mint, because up until Ubuntu 16.04, the Mate edition came along, Linux Mint was right up at the top of my list of being one of my favorite distros. The difference between the two systems is the fact that the Mate developers, they have built an architecture that is very dynamic and it is easy to change and it will roll with the changes. Linux Mint, although I love them, they have gotten to a place in their development where they are now trying to resist what is coming from the upstream projects that they rely on. Like, for instance, I've touched on client-side decorations in the GNOME desktop. So now the Mint developers have actually gone off and they're forking a bunch of applications, which they're calling X apps, which will appear in Linux Mint 18 down the road here, that avoid all of that. So I find that to be a little bit strange. It's like, okay, so roll with it. This is where the technology is going. And the GNOME project is so huge and such a force that it just seems silly to me to not go in the direction that they're going right now, if that makes sense. I'm not a huge GNOME fanboy, but I'm just saying that why do you have to dig in your heels and say, well, I'm not going to do this? This is obviously the direction that the ecosystem is going in. And so that kind of bugs me about Linux Mint. Linux Mint has the software manager in it. And what they essentially do is that when you install Linux Mint on your machine, they give you a configuration that will get everything working. Okay? That's fine. But if down the road you decide that you want to do something different with your machine and you don't want to do it the Mint way, sometimes that can create an issue because now you've got to figure out how they've set it up and then you're going to change it. And the other thing is they have a software manager that has pretty much all of the applications that are available on Ubuntu and Linux Mint. And of course, the Linux Mint folks add their own tools to that. All right? And it's a good application. But Ubuntu Mate, whatever, has come up with a better idea. And that is the software boutique, which allows you to pick and choose software that most people are using right now, the most demanded software. There's not a a whole huge list of applications in here. You don't have to, if you look for email clients, for instance, you're not inundated with 40 of them or whatever. It's very easy for new users to figure out what they need. And I've talked about this thing before, and I'm going to talk about it again because it is so awesome. You come in here, you click on what application that you need. One click, it asks for your password, it installs it. And it doesn't matter where it comes from. Like Google Chrome, for instance, is not in the Ubuntu repositories. It's not in the Linux Mint repositories. That is something that you download from Google. The process to get Google Chrome installed on a Linux Mint machine or an Ubuntu machine is rather complicated for somebody who is brand new to Linux. You have to download the deb file. You have to choose the right deb file. Make sure you got the right one. Then you have to install it using GDebi or Software Center. And then it's going to add its own repository to it and all that stuff. And this little bit of a process is actually hard for people who are unfamiliar with the system to get through. And it's a bit of a pain in the butt even if you know how to do it. Okay? They have cut through all that crap here. This is something that's new and awesome. One click, it goes out, it gets the deb file, it installs it, it puts the repository in, done. And the same thing goes for Spotify and many of the other applications that come to us from other sources other than the Ubuntu repositories. Also coming along here, we're going to have snap packages. This architecture that the Ubuntu Mate team has done is going to allow that to be integrated at some point down the road. This is a dynamic application, and when you first install it, you subscribe to a PPA for it, and anytime anything changes, run your updates and you're going to get it. That is awesome. Awesome. Also here we have the welcome screen, which is another awesome thing about Ubuntu Mate. This is just incredible. You can get a Linux machine up and running and installed. You never have to open a terminal. You can get all the latest, greatest stuff, and it's all right here. I've talked about that. The Ubuntu Mate implementation of the Ubuntu, the Mate desktop, is very flexible. And Mint comes up with the quote-unquote Mint configuration. Now, of course, you can go in and change that and make that however you want. These guys have made it so that you can choose all kinds of crazy layouts, all right, and change your desktop however you want to with Mate Tweak here. And you can also change what compositor you use. They have choices for Compiz and software rendering Marco and Marco that uses Compton. This is awesome. Now, to a new user, they probably wouldn't understand what that was all about, but hey, they're going to learn, over time. So yeah, there's huge differences and lots of differences under the hood, and it's not a rolling distro by any stretch of the imagination, but it's going to give you access to more up-to-date hardware than you would get from, let's say, standard Linux Mint or Ubuntu. And I think that it's a better experience for new users, which is one of the reasons that I'm so excited about it. So yeah, there's a lot of differences, but that's the main one. Why don't you use different hard drives, one hard disk with Windows, another with Linux? This is another one of those exemplary comments. I posted a video quite a while back now called the Dual Boot Deception, where I talked about how the Ubuntu installer made setting up a pre-configured dual boot with Windows extremely easy. Of course, now we're dealing with Windows 10, which is not easy to dual boot, so this is kind of a past tense sort of thing anyway. But the point of that video was to point out that this was something that was a problem for brand new users. I'm not saying that nobody should ever dual boot their computer. And actually, this person is absolutely correct. If you are going to run your computer in a dual boot environment, using 2 hard drives is the best way to go. The machine that I'm recording this video is technically a dual boot. There is a Windows hard drive on this machine. Nobody's using it and it hasn't been booted in forever, but if you want it, it's there. And that setup seems to work best, but as time rolls on here, the whole concept of dual booting is going to become more nerdified than it is now. It's going to be something that nerds do, and that's just because the Linux developers have had to make Linux so accessible in so many ways and so compatible with other operating systems, simply because it was the underdog. But as Linux gains its own identity, I'm hoping that Ubuntu will come to a place where they don't offer dual boot out of the box. And usually, if there is an operating system already on the machine, by default, Ubuntu will offer to set up a dual boot instead of blowing it off the machine or something else. So, yeah, I've commented on this video before. That's the most controversial video I've ever done. People just did not seem to get what I was trying to say. But I'm not a huge fan of dual booting. I think that the best experience that you get from a computer is when you have one operating system that is native to that machine. Whatever operating system that is, whether it's Windows or Mac or FreeBSD or Solaris or whatever you're running, or Linux, then I think that you get the best experience when it's the only thing on the machine. And that dovetails into another comment that I've gotten. I've gotten several of these little comments lately where people correct me because I call Linux Linux, and there is a faction in the community that wants to call Linux GNU Linux or GNU Linux. And this comes mainly from Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation. It is a well-known fact that Linus Torvalds created a kernel for Linux and then used pieces of the GNU operating system to fill that out. And of course, most of the open source software uses the GNU General Public License. And GNU is the correct pronunciation as per Richard Stallman. Okay? It's not just GNU anyway. And Richard Stallman, for many years in his speeches, has said that we should all call it GNU Linux because it's really the GNU operating system with a Linux kernel. I see his point. I think it's rather valid in some respects. But the GNU operating system has its own kernel, the herd, and so therefore I think we should call Linux Linux and GNU GNU and let it go at that. Besides, from a marketing point of view, at this point everybody knows Linux as being Linux, and Richard Stallman is fighting a losing battle, and a lot of the things that he says I find to be really out there anyway, but that's just my personal opinion, so I'll call it Linux, and I'm going to continue to call it Linux. Actually, at some point, and I probably should have done this a long time ago, is just call it Ubuntu. People know the name Ubuntu before they know the name Linux anyway. The Ubuntu is recognized as an operating system. Linux is servers to the average person, if they've ever heard of it at all. So, really, we should be saying Ubuntu more than we say Linux, if we're talking about the Ubuntu operating system, or Fedora if you're talking about Fedora, or Arch. But Linux is shorthand for the entire Linux ecosystem at this point. If someone has AMD ATI graphics in Ubuntu 16.04, they will not maintain the proprietary drivers anymore. Sorry, I did not correct that person's spelling, but I know what they're talking about. There is a story that popped up a couple of weeks ago, and I really don't know all the details about it, that Ubuntu 16.04 is going to drop support for AMD video cards. They're not going to have the native AMD closed source drivers available by default in the system. And my attitude on this is good. I'm glad they're not doing that, because the AMD drivers usually are way more trouble than they're actually worth. I have had many clients who have AMD graphics in their computers, and I tell them, don't install the AMD driver. Stay with the open source driver. It's better. Now, if you're somebody who really needs high frame rates and you need super acceleration, you can certainly give those AMD drivers a try. But if you start running into big problems with your system, you can blame them. Rolling back to the open source drivers will help stabilize things quite a bit. It is unfortunate that AMD has done such a piss poor job of supporting the Linux operating system simply because there are so many computers out there that are going to be, that have AMD-based graphics, ATI graphics in them. But the truth of the matter is their drivers are horrible, and they have been for a long, long time. I think the last machine that I actually used the proprietary AMD drivers in was an Acer laptop that I had way back a long time ago, and the open source driver way outperformed the AMD drive, the proprietary drivers. So my opinion on that is good. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about hardware. If you want to use Linux and you want to get the best out of it, you really need to get the hardware that works the best with it. And right now, the company that is doing the most to support the Linux ecosystem, a hardware manufacturer, is Intel. Intel has rolled a lot of their drivers into the Linux kernel. So, for example, on this machine, I'm using a native Intel driver that's in the kernel. No, this is not an open source back engineered. This is from Intel. It's in the kernel. So I'm getting the best performance that I could possibly get anyway. But right now, Intel hardware seems to be a better bet, and if you go look at what System76 or Dell is doing, those machines are shipping with Intel chipsets, and they work better with Linux than anything AMD. But I have one machine that is all AMD. It has an AMD processor, it has AMD graphics in it, I use the open source drivers, and it works beautifully. And it happens to be the machine that Cindy plays all her games on, and she never really has any complaints. So once again, it goes back to computers having their own personality and all that stuff. That's an old 4200 graphics card in that machine, though. And native drivers for Linux have not been available for a long, long time. I don't even bother with it. So we'll see how that develops. It will probably be a situation where if you did want to install the driver, you would probably have to go download it from the AMD site and then install it manually, which you've always been able to do anyway. And the last question from this video is, if I upgrade from 1404 without installing it from scratch, will it break my system? I've got a lot of stuff configured on 1404, and I hate it if I have to reconfigure everything if I do a clean install. Okay, this is a question that's going to come along now because a lot of people are considering moving from 1404 to 1604. And my quick answer to this is back everything up before you either do an in-place upgrade or you reinstall. Because my experience with in-place upgrades with Ubuntu is that they generally work pretty well, but it most likely will not install all of the software that you had installed on the machine already. It may do some of it, it may do none of it, but if you have any PPAs hooked up to the machine, it's not going to do that. So the good thing about that, of course, is that all of your data stays in place and your configuration settings stay the same for, like, let's say the Unity desktop. So if you went from 1404 to 1604 and you use the upgrade option that they're going to be releasing soon, then it will just replace the operating system and leave all your personal data alone. Whether all the software will be there, that's a good question. And I have found already that there are a few packages that were available in Ubuntu 1404 that are not readily available in 1604. They have taken some things out of the repositories. They've added new things. So if you may run into a situation where some little program that you've been using you're not going to find in 1404. So that's all a possibility. So I say, whatever you do, back it up. My own personal preference is to reinstall, start over, because you're just going to get better. I mean, there's less chance of having something get screwed up if you do that. But if you want to do an in-place upgrade, you can go ahead and give that a try, but don't be surprised if not everything works, and don't be surprised if you have to reinstall a lot of software, and you may actually have to end up reinstalling the whole machine from scratch anyway. So it's worth a try, but keep that in mind. I do have one computer, the laptop computer that's currently running Ubuntu 1404 with the Unity desktop, that I'm planning on taking it through an in-place upgrade just to see what happens, because I do want to move that machine up to 1604. So that's something that's going to happen later on. So when I do that, we'll talk more about it. So anyway, there's our Q&A video for today. And very quickly before I wrap up here, I wanted to say thank you to everybody who has responded to my call for help as far as coming up with a logo for EzeeLinux. And I've had several responses already. And my strategy here is to collect what people send me as far as images are concerned, and then somewhere down the road here, I'm going to do a video where I'm going to show you guys all of those images, and I'm going to let you vote on it and let you have some input on it. So that is coming up somewhere down the road. So you just look for the last video I did where I talked about that. Also, in the comments section of that video, somebody was kind enough to post all of the DPI dimensions for YouTube and Facebook and all of that stuff. So just scroll down and look for those. They're in there if that's something that you want to try and do. So I have all of this stuff kind of just sitting on the desktop. It's in that little folder right there. And so when I get enough together to do that video, we will stop taking submissions and I will go through them, and you guys can help me choose which one to actually use on EzeeLinux. So thank you very much for that. Be sure to check out EzeeLinux on the web. Check out EzeeLinux on Facebook, and if you would, give it a like. And also check out freedompenguin.com for all sorts of articles about Linux by me and many other contributors. I don't know what article I'm going to be posting next there, but I do know of some that are coming down the road that are really interesting. So you definitely want to check that out. And we will talk again soon. Thank you once again for watching the video.